Just fall in one of three categories. One is miserable. Anybody here know of anybody who is in a miserable marriage? I suspicion so. Yeah. There are miserable marriages. A second kind of a marriage is a mediocre marriage. There's a lot of them. Mediocre is ordinary, run-of-the-mill. There are miserable marriages. There are mediocre marriages. They're just average. They're just ordinary. But here is the way I feel about this. If you claim to be a child of God, and if your purpose is to glorify God, there's only one kind of marriage to shoot for, and that's magnificent. A magnificent marriage. It can't be perfect, but it can be magnificent. If both of you are all in on total giving, total self, total lifetime, you can have a magnificent marriage at any period, any age of your life. But it's all about the giving. And it's in the giving that you find out that you receive way more than you give. I challenge every married couple to settle for nothing less than a magnificent marriage. Maybe that article, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2, will help you out a little bit. One of the most inspiring and thoughtful and helpful feedbacks I ever got was in Alamosa, Colorado. On a Wednesday night, after we had finished a Sunday through Wednesday type format, Maldonado was the couple's last name. And brother and sister Maldonado came to me on Wednesday night, and he said, with his wife at his side, he at 80, his wife in her upper 70s. He said, Dean, we want you to know how much this workshop has helped our marriage. He said last night, Tuesday night, he said, we went home and we talked about what each of us liked about being married to one another. They had never done that before, but they did that in the course of the Widowhood workshop that they experienced. I thought, man, that's great. You know, here's an older couple with years of experience, and they know that they can make their marriage even better. And that's what they wanted to do. And they started talking about some stuff they hadn't talked about before. You know, marriage is a ministry. Husband and a wife, it's a ministry. And one way that we glorify God is being a great husband or being a great wife and having a magnificent marriage. God's glorified by that. It just proves God was right when he started this whole marriage business in the first place. We got to start with a little bit of levity. Since we just ate, here's some things about food. Doctor, I've got metal fillings in my teeth. My refrigerator has magnets, and they keep pulling me into the kitchen, and that's why I have a weight problem. Here's one lady that said, Dear Santa, I have been nice all year long. Most of the time, Santa, I've been good. Well, once in a while. Okay, Santa, never mind. I'll just buy my own stuff. But give me one thing. Give me weight loss. A recent study has found that women carrying a little extra weight live longer than men who mention it. According to my height and weight, I should be 9 foot 4 inches. So my weight is okay. It's my height that's the problem. So a compliment to that, losing weight does not seem to be working for me. I think I'm going to concentrate on getting taller. I like this one. Bread is like the sun. It rises in the yeast and sets in the waste. And you got to make fun of married people. If you're not one, you have the right to make fun of married people. Honey, the husband said to his wife, I invited a friend over for supper. What? She says, are you crazy? House is a mess. I didn't go shopping. All the dishes are dirty. I don't feel like a fancy meal. He said, I know all of that. Then why in blue blazes did you invite a friend over for supper? The poor fool's thinking about getting married. She said, okay, let him come. A couple was celebrating their golden wedding anniversary. Their domestic tranquility had been the talk of their town. What a peaceful and loving couple that they were. A local newspaper reporter was inquiring as to the secret of their long and happy marriage because that newspaper person wanted to write one of these really glowing, positive articles about this wonderful married couple. Well, the local newspaper fellow went and did the interview, and he asked about the secret to their long and happy marriage. Well, the man said it dates back to our honeymoon. We visited the Grand Canyon. We took a trip down at the bottom of the canyon by pack of mule. We hadn't gone too far when my wife's mule stumbled, and my wife quietly said, "That's once." We proceeded a little further, and the mule stumbled once more, and my wife quietly said, "That's twice." We hadn't gone a half a mile when the mule stumbled a third time. My wife quietly removed a revolver from her purse and shot the mule dead. I started to have an angry protest over her treatment of the mule when she looked at me and she said, "Okay, that's once." And we've been living happily ever after since then. Oh, a little levity makes life a little bit more endurable, doesn't it? A little bit more able to endure. Let me read to you the introduction of the book, From One Widow to Another. Imagine a single event that will dramatically change your calendar, your checkbook, your friendship network, the contents of your refrigerator, the temperature that you set your thermostat on, your outlook on your future, your connection with your children. And that's not all. Your appearance may change, your emotions, your sleep patterns, your theology, your social status, and possibly your address. I experienced most of these changes and more beginning April 21, 2006, the day I became a widow. I don't like the word widow. I still will not check that box to identify myself. Turning points in life, such as deciding to marry, divorce, becoming a parent, finding a career, all these events are accompanied by large changes. The difference in these is that we choose them, but becoming a widow happens. Many of the changes in my life were surprises, and many were not pleasant. But here I am, perhaps you too, joined in this elite club of widowhood, one we did not choose to belong to, but were a part of. That is the reality. Well, whenever we become widowed, and the whole no longer exists, and we used to be half of that whole, it does a number on us, and we start thinking stuff we've never thought about before. We start feeling things we've never felt before. And we can't help but naturally, because we have marital experience, wonder about marriage again. Well, I've had the opportunity, since I've started this widowhood workshop ministry, to meet and visit with, talk with, listen to a lot of folks who have married again. I solicit for stories of love and loss, as a matter of fact. One preacher friend of mine said in regard to his mother and father, he sent me this email. He said, "My dad died in January of 2013. There was a man at Mom's church whose wife died the day before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I married this man and my mother last April. Mom is 88 and he is 78. One of my favorite remarried couples is Bill and Verl. I met them in Middle Tennessee. They're members of the Woodson Chapel Church of Christ. They both had long and happy marriages. One of their spouses died of ovarian cancer, and the other one died after a long battle with Parkinson's disease for 10 years. Both of these people, Bill and Verl, were faithful caregivers to one another. I had the opportunity, when I was doing a widowhood workshop in Nashville, to eat lunch with this wonderful older couple. I asked them, after I'd heard their story, I asked Verl, I said, "Verl, will you send me your story?" And so she sent me a handwritten story about their life. One had been widowed for 14 years, and the other had been widowed for 10 years. 14 and 10 years. One day, after all those years, Bill's son said to Bill, Bill, why don't you ask Verl out on a date? Well, Bill thought about that for a little bit. Then he thought about it a little bit longer. And one day, he decided to call Verl. And he called her and asked her out on a date. He said, I asked her out on a date. And she said yes. And he said, I didn't know what to do after that. He had forgotten what to do after that. But they went out on that date. And they eventually, after visiting together in a number of different ways and having a number of different experiences together, they decided to get married together. After dating and falling in love again, we got married. I want to read to you what she said at the end of the story. Now our lives are so much happier. God's work can now be done together. What a sweet story. The second place I ever did a widowhood workshop was in Medina, Ohio, in the northern part of the state, about in the middle of the state. And I met this lady at the end of that workshop who came to me, and she had a big, broad smile. I would guess her at that time to have been in her early 60s. That's just a guess of mine. And she said, I got to tell you my story. Well, she told me her story, and then I said, you got to send me an email. Don't expect me to remember all that. Send me an email. And so she sent me an email, and I'll just try to summarize it for you. She had lost her husband in 2012. She had been married for 38 and a half years. This man had lost his wife in 2013, and he'd been married for 40 years. They went out. Their first date was a coffee date at McDonald's. When she writes about that experience, she honestly said that when we went out on that date and met after Wednesday night Bible study, she said, I could not hold that cup of coffee. I was shaking. I was so nervous. I appreciated her being so transparent, sharing that nervousness that she felt about engaging in this experience again. Well, they started enjoying some experiences together. But he went to Arkansas to visit his son, and she stayed in Ohio, and she started having some health problems. And you probably know where this is going. She ends up with a cancer diagnosis. She tells me in this story, she says, I just knew that when he heard that I had cancer, that was going to be the end of our relationship. But it wasn't that way. He found out about her cancer diagnosis. As a matter of fact, he called her when she was driving home in tears from the oncology doctor. And he told her, he said, where are you going? Where can we meet? He's not going to give up on her. He's not going to distance himself from her. And he was with her every step of the way. She wrote in this email, she said, he saw me at my worst. I could not have looked any worse. I couldn't have been in any worse condition than I was. He saw me without a lick of hair. He saw me when I was puking my guts out. And he was by her side the entire time. You know what happened? Those treatments were helpful to her. She rebounded. She got more healthy. She got in a recovered state and was in remission. And they got married. The last part of this email says in her words, I never thought I could love someone else, and neither did he. And they are so very happy together. But it doesn't always work that way. Here is to give you a little insight into what goes on inside of a person after the loss of their spouse. Thinking about this whole male-female relationship thing after loss in a word is kind of weird, and it can be very uncomfortable, and it can be very, very difficult and complicated. This gal wrote me this email on July 30th, 2016. This was 2.5 years after her loss. I knew her and I knew her husband. There was this one Sunday, about a month before my wife died. This was November of 2013. She was making breakfast on Sunday before they went to church, and she sent her teenage daughter down to the basement to get her father and to bring him up for breakfast. When the teenage daughter went down there, she saw her father dead of evidently a massive heart attack. They were married when they were 19. She was 19. He was 23. They were married for 23 years. They had 2 daughters. The 2 daughters were 13 and 16 at the time. Now it's 2.5 years after that death. First of all, it scares me to think about the whole thing of dating and starting over again. I'm not sure if I can love someone again like I loved Gary. I'm very lonely and I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before, about if something happens to one of us, that we would want the other to remarry. It was easy to say that when he was here, but now he is gone. That's more difficult to talk about now. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure that my heart is ready to be able to handle that again. It scares me because I know if I get married, that if my spouse goes before me again, I'm having to experience loss. Maybe I'm being selfish, but I still have a hole in my heart that I'm not sure anybody could fill. I have such mixed feelings about the whole thing. My girls told me a little while after their father passed away that it's okay if I remarry. They said they want me to be happy. I do want to be happy, but I am so scared. I never thought at my age I would have to be starting over again. Dating, she said, just scares me. In Virginia, I know a widow who had these friends who both lost their spouses. And after they lost their spouses, a while after they'd lost their spouses, these 2 friends of this widow lady that I know, they got married again. And they ended up going to this widowed friend of mine because what happened was, eventually in their marriage, they started struggling. Effie, for instance, was the lady's name, the widow who had remarried. Effie mentioned to me that she wished she had never gotten married again. He controlled what television shows she watched. He was very jealous at any man at church who would give me a hug. Effie's previous husband was an elder in the Lord's church there. They were a beloved couple. Everybody loved her. So after her loss, a lot of people hugged her. But this new husband didn't like that. And he was a control freak, trying to control her life, even to the extent of what television shows that she watched. Well, then it went a little bit later, and Effie got a form of dementia. So Effie's husband goes to this widowed friend of mine, and here's what he says. He told me this is not the way he envisioned his second marriage. See, his second wife now has dementia. So he's going to be in a caregiving role. And so he tells this widowed friend of mine, he told me that this was not what he envisioned in his marriage. He remarried to have a wife to take care of him, not to take care of her. Let me cut to the chase and read what I think is one of the saddest ones. This was a public Facebook post. This was a lady who was a daughter of an elder in the Lord's church, a shepherd in the Lord's church, and she posted on Facebook publicly these comments. Dear Facebook friends, I don't normally write very personal posts, but because my friends on Facebook in my life are like family to me, I want to tell you about the recent events in my life. I know some of you have been concerned about me, and I appreciate that more than you could know. It's hard to talk to everyone all the time, so maybe this post will answer some questions and elicit some prayers. Please know that this is difficult for me to write, but I feel like I need to make everything clear. I'm just ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband, Jim, passed away in June of 2014. It forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone months later, and we married in July of 2015. While that may seem very quick, at the time, I didn't see it that way. I was lonely and should never have remarried so quickly. I don't want to go into all the details on Facebook, but after several rounds of heartache with this person, we are now divorcing. Being a teacher in a small town for 25 years lends itself to knowing many, many people. I am taking back Jim, her first husband's name. I'm taking back Jim's last name as he was the love of my life and my soulmate. Please pray for me and Lexi, our daughter, as I continue to grieve for Jim and as I move toward a better life. But now it is such an embarrassing situation. You all know me. You all know that what I've only wanted is a loving marriage, like many of you have. However, I know it's time to be still and wait on the Lord's timing and his plan. There are great stories of wonderful, wonderful marriages after loss. There are also stories of heartache and more grief from marrying a second time. It can go either direction. If that is true, then it would be a really good thing for us to think about this and talk about this before we ever experience it. You know, when our emotions are really high, when we're very emotional for whatever reason, it could be because of a great success, a wonderful achievement, you know, just a really wonderful, special, positive time in our life. We're just ecstatic. When we are really emotional, how good do we think? When we're really pumped emotionally, we don't think very rationally. When we're in deep grief, when we're feeling real negative emotionally, again, our emotions are really high. We are not going to think very clearly. So that's why when we're on an emotional high or an emotional low, we need to be extremely careful. No matter why we're on the emotional high, no matter why we're on the emotional low, we just need to be really careful to not let our feeler drive our actions. What we need to do is always remind ourselves that we need to be led by our thinker, not our feeler. Sometimes what we need to do is we need to take our thinker and grab a hold of our feeler and drag our feeler in the direction that we know our thinking should take us in our life. When we make decisions based on emotion more than thinking, we often find ourselves in trouble. That's why the parents of teenagers don't sleep well. You know, it's just a common thing when we're young. We make a lot of emotional decisions because we haven't got a grip on life yet. You know, even our brains. Do you know that a teenager's brain, by the way, if you ever have a kid say, why? Why do I have to do what you want me to do? You can tell them, and you can even have them Google this to prove it. You can tell them your brain is not fully developed yet. That's why. Mine is and yours isn't. It's only in your early 20s that your brain is fully developed. So you can play that card with them anytime. And if they don't believe it, they can research it. The fact is, even with our fully developed brains, sometimes as more mature adults, we can make some decisions that are based more on emotion than on thinking. That can be scary, and we're far more likely to make a mistake if our life is driven by our emotions rather than being directed by our thinking. It's for that reason that before we experience this emotional time in our life, we need to think about marriage after loss. Let me share with you some things, and I'm going to have to do this pretty quickly, so strap on your seatbelt. We're fixing to take a flight, and you just follow along with me as best you can with your concentration. The Bible says, if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. In other words, the person who's lost their mate has every right in the world to marry again. Every right in the world, as much as she had or he had the right to marry the first time, they have the right to marry the second time. However, the Bible, if we're going to use the Bible to direct our lives, does have this qualifying prepositional phrase, only in the Lord. Only in the Lord. There are two generic philosophies or conclusions about that phrase. I will share them with you. Some people think that that phrase indicates that, in other words, if a Christian loses their spouse, that what they need to realize is they have every right in the world to marry, but they need to be careful and marry only somebody who is also a Christian, who is in the Lord. In other words, the qualifying phrase there has to do with the person that you marry. Now, there is another possibility with this phrase. If you go back to English class, now I know some of you, that was like a nightmarish experience, but let's take you back there for just a little bit. You know, back in English class, there are adverbs and adjectives. Now, is this an adjective-like phrase that describes the person, or is this more like an adverbial phrase that modifies the action of marriage? In other words, only in the Lord could mean that you make sure that you marry somebody that you have a right to marry. Somebody who in the sight of God has the right to be married. Which does it mean? I'll honestly say I don't know. I'm not real sure myself. Here's what I do know from that passage. I know this without question, that what this passage is doing, whatever it's doing specifically, I know it's doing this generically. It's throwing up a red flag. Be careful. What I know is that phrase, only in the Lord, is a restrictive phrase. However, whatever way in which it restricts, I know it's a restrictive phrase. It says only in the Lord. I want to suggest that we just need to be careful and realize that when we're thinking about marriage after loss, that we need to exercise caution. We need to be careful and not just try to self-medicate our grief by filling that hole with another person. We human beings can replace a tire. What do us guys do when the tire goes flat? We just get another tire, we replace that tire, and we get back on the road and we roll. People are not replaced. In human relationships, you don't replace people. After we've lost our spouse, we've got to realize whether we choose to marry or not marry again, one thing is for sure, you cannot replace your spouse. Your spouse was an individual. Your marriage was a unique relationship. I have read on the internet, where everything is true, that there are 7.7 billion people in this world. In my little brain of 80 plus million cells, I read that on Facebook too. I can't comprehend 7.5 plus billion of anything. But that's how many people we're living with on the face of God's green earth. 7.5 or 7.7 in that area, billion people. When you're married, of all of those 7.7 billion people, it's only you and one other person in that relationship. Man, that makes your marriage special. That makes your marriage exclusively special. If you lose that marriage, you cannot replace that person. People cannot be, things can be replaced. People cannot be replaced. We do need to be extremely careful in regard to the experience and consideration of marriage after loss. I like this observation. Einstein, the writer of this book, Step Family Living, says the most critical key for remarriage preparation is to resolve or mourn the loss of former relationships. That's true of people who've experienced divorce, as well as people who have experienced the loss of their mate by death. We have to do our mourning. We have to do our grieving and do it in a good and a healthy way so that we can recover, we can heal. We're still going to have wounds, and that's just the reality. We may live with those wounds the rest of our life because that's our history, that's our experience, that's what we lived. But we need to be extremely careful that we make sure that we give ourselves wholly and fully to the grief process before we choose to move on to another relationship. I like this observation. You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with another person. One of the things that I, again, passionately prayed about after the loss of my wife is I prayed that God would help me to find contentment in my widowhood instead of trying to fill that hole with another person, thinking I could replace Ruth Ann. We need to get to a better place individually to become our new person before we ever choose to get married again. For some people, it doesn't take that long. For other people, it may take a good while. But we need to be okay on ourselves. If the only way that you can be okay is to be married, what does that say about you and your relationship with the Lord? Have you ever thought about that? If the only way that in your mind and in your heart you can be okay is to be married, what does that say about you and about your relationship with the Lord? Think about it this way. The Apostle Paul said, I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. In our culture, we have what is called marital states, and we check one. Okay? Single, check. Married, check. Divorced, check. Widowed, check. I mean, there are marital states or conditions. Is it possible for a person to be single and have a life of contentment? Maybe for some people, we might ask, is it possible to be married and have a life of contentment? Is it possible to be divorced and have a life of contentment? To be widowed and have a life of contentment? If our contentment hinges on our relationship with the Lord and not our circumstances, the answer to that question is yes. But if our contentment hinges on our life circumstances, the answer is no. Our contentment needs to hang on, needs to depend on, not our circumstances, but our relationship with Jesus Christ. If we're Christians, if we're followers of Jesus, wholly devoted to Him, it is in Him, not our state or condition of life, that we find our contentment. That is very hard to do. Very hard to do. How many of you know somebody who has never been married before? How many of you know somebody who has never been married before? Yeah, a bunch of you do. A bunch of you do. They're normal people. And it's okay. And I know some very devoted Christians who've never been married before. But those people can find contentment. What is in control of our contentment? Well, let's decide that we have healed. We're still wounded. We'll be wounded to some extent, probably the rest of our life, but we decide that we're going to get remarried. What should be considered? What should be considered before we get married? Now, if we're going to get married again, a really good thing to do would be go back to the basics. And one of the things I love is when I have younger people in an audience where we can talk about this. Because the very things that ought to be considered before we marry again are the same things that people should consider before they ever get married the first time. Let me share with you some things. There are some myths about marriage. In our world, there are a lot of myths about marriage. Let me share with you some. This book, Fit to be Tied, is a book that I've used in premarital counseling for a number of years. And they have a great chapter in the first part of this book. And here's some of the things that they cite. Marriage will end my aloneness. Do you think everybody who's married that they never feel alone again after their marriage? There are some very lonely married people. Well, how about this one? Marriage will heal my brokenness. If you're broken before you say I do, and then you say I do, is that going to magically change you from not being broken anymore? It's not a magical phrase. That I do is not a magical phrase. It's not going to change your brokenness just because you're married again. And then how about this? Marriage will ensure my happiness. Anybody here know anybody who's married but unhappy? Now, I'm not talking about you personally. Do you know of other people? Let's talk about people who are not here. All of us know people who are married but they're unhappy. Marriage does not guarantee happiness. Now, it should. I mean, that's theoretically, that should be a byproduct of that commitment. And it's wonderful. But it's no guarantee. You can really be very unhappy and be married. And then this one, marriage is God's plan for everyone. Now, that's a myth. And we know people. We've already admitted we know people who have never chosen to marry. And that's okay. That doesn't make them strange. It doesn't make them weird. It's just the way that they're living, and that's okay for some people, and they can find contentment in that. If they give themselves wholly to the Lord, they can find contentment in that. Well, what should be considered? Let me share with you some things. I'm going to give you this quick list of some things that really need to be considered before marriage. And a lot of these things are as true going from being single to being married as they are true for going from widowed to being married again. Things that ought to be considered. The most important thing for marital success is spiritual compatibility. That is the number one thing. I'm almost hesitant to use this terminology. It's the trump card. It's the trump card. It is the most important card to be able to play in a marriage relationship. Some of you will admit, if you're honest, marriage can be hard. Marriage can be really hard sometimes. The person that you married sometimes is very hard to live with. And sometimes that person that you're married to finds it very hard to live with you too. Marriage, because we're flawed people, can be very hard. Our circumstances can contribute to sometimes marriage being very hard. Sometimes those loving children we give birth to can make our marriage very hard and very complicated. You know what can help you with the most difficult, challenging life circumstances as a married couple committed to one another for life? Spiritual compatibility. If you have two people who are totally devoted to the Lord, who want to be in their life totally submitted to the will of God in their life, and they want to mold and shape their life and their marriage consistent with the will of God, they're going to win. They're going to have a magnificent marriage no matter what odds that they face, no matter what challenges that they may experience, no matter about the behavior of their children or the choices of their children. They can have a magnificent marriage because they have the trump card. That trump card of spiritual compatibility means that you have common values. What matters most? You share that, what matters most. You have a common blueprint for your life. You have a common goal in your life. You want to glorify God. You want to leave this life and you want to be with the Lord for eternity. When you share those things in common, you become more than a victor. more than a conqueror, because you have the trump card of spiritual compatibility. Being on the same page spiritually is the best thing that we can share if we're going to get married to somebody else. Another thing that needs to be considered is time. Time is the acid test of all human relationships. Do you remember back, and now for some of you it may be ancient history, but do you remember back when you were dating, when you were trying to sell yourself to that other person? How do we behave when we're trying to market ourselves to that other person? Anybody? How do we behave? How do we behave? Extra careful, okay? Extra careful. Tell me some things that we do to make sure that we're extra careful and we market ourselves really effectively to the other person. Okay. You don't bring your girlfriend over to the house and have a bunch of your clothes strewn in the living room. Your dirty, smelly socks, for instance. Okay? What else do you do when you're dating? Okay, you communicate a lot. You communicate a lot. What else do you do? Oh, you open the door of the car. How about if you take a shower once in a while too? You know, you put your best. Let me tell you about Ruth Ann, that lovely young lady I met when I first went to church when I was 15 years old. I was way more interested in her than the Lord, honestly, at start. And I met her. And you know one thing that she would never, we met when we were 15 years old at church. One thing that she would never let me see is she would never, I'm thinking about the age of the people here. Okay, she would never let me see her in curlers. Now, some of you might need to Google that, hair curlers. I'll show you a picture. Okay, she would never let me see her. She'd never be caught dead in curlers. But after I said I do, it's like it didn't matter. I mean, it's like she was a different person. She slept in those things. I saw her like that when we went to bed. I saw her like that when we woke up. We're on our best behavior when we start, relating to the opposite gender, with this interest in mind. It's a natural, normal thing. Well, what happens, though, over a period of time is you can't hide your real self forever. What's going to happen, it's a human thing. What's going to happen is eventually there's going to be these little times where you're going to drop these hints about who you really are. You know what you need to see before you marry somebody? You need to see them angry. How are they when they're angry? How are they when they're excited? How do they handle money? How do they handle tension? You see these things over a period of time when you have different experiences with them and you make these observations. It'd be really good to know the person before you marry them. Okay, I'm not so naive as to suggest we can know somebody 100%, but we need to know that person, the real person, not the best foot forward person, the real person. If you want to have a really great relationship and a close relationship with another person, you need to have time with that person and experiences with that person to get to know them. The U.S. Census Bureau says, from their studies of our United States culture. Now remember, this is statistics. This is not personal. We can be a statistical anomaly if we wish to. In other words, we don't have to be a statistic. We can be the oddball. We can be the one that's different, the anomaly. The U.S. Census Bureau says this: widowed people in our country, if they marry within 2 years of their loss, the divorce rate in those marriages is over 50%. Over 50%. Now that's despite their marital experience, which you think would make them wiser. Marital experience ought to make you wiser, better prepared for a second marriage. But what happens again is sometimes we are so driven by our emotions, we are so deeply and painfully lonely that we think the way to address that, the only way to effectively address that is to marry again. And we have a tendency to kind of rush that process. And sometimes that doesn't end well. Now, having said all that, I know of those who are statistical anomalies, people who have gotten married much quicker than that, much earlier than that, and it's worked out fine. But again, that spiritual compatibility, that really matters. And sometimes that spiritual compatibility can help you a lot when you have less time together, because your first commitment is loving the Lord. You know who is a really good person to marry? Somebody who loves the Lord more than they love you. You ever thought about that? I have a friend of mine. I wish, having 3 daughters, I wish I would have learned this earlier. This friend of mine who works with the Roosevelt Drive Church in Jacksonville in the Carolinas, he said this to the guy who came to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. So he says, can I get hitched to your daughter? His response was this. He said, do you love the Lord more than you love my daughter? If I was him, I would have thought that was a trick question. Here's this guy who's a preacher. I'm dating his daughter. How am I supposed to answer that question? I'm not really sure. I'm kind of sweating right now even thinking about that. He said, and here's what he said to that boy. He said, if you love the Lord more than you love my daughter, you can have her hand in marriage. I thought, wow, I wish I would have learned that before I gave the hands of my daughters to those men. That is the trump card. This spiritual compatibility is so valuable, so helpful in a marriage relationship. Time is the acid test of relationships because we can't hide who we truly are over a long period of time. Another thing that we've got to consider is family blending. There are books written about blended families. There's a lot of research done about blended families. You know why? Because this is a very complicated issue, a very complicated issue. We need to realize that this is a complicated issue. And for different families, it's going to be different. These things are things that we need to really think about ahead of time. Would you want to marry somebody who will distance you from your children? Relationally distance you from your own children? It can be a very complicated thing. Not all children can be on board. Maybe there needs to be a little work with the children and the grandchildren if there are grandchildren involved, because family blending matters, because that's what you're doing when you're getting married. You're blending families. Then there are expectations. Expectations need to be considered. Where do we get our expectations? A lot of times we get them from the past. You may have heard the story about these 2 people who got married, and the first morning after they got married, the alarm clock went off. Well, with his marriage, his previous marriage, his wife got up and made the coffee. She got up first. But his second wife never got up and made the coffee. So he's laying there waiting for her to make the coffee. Why isn't she getting up and making the coffee? Well, in her first marriage, he got up first and he made the coffee. You just have these natural expectations because of your past experiences, and it has a way of affecting you then as you move from one marriage to another marriage. And so some of these things need to be talked about beforehand. Some of these things about how was your marriage? How did you do this? How did you do that? Expectations need to be considered before a marriage. And then there's sex and other health type issues that are going to be obviously heavily weighted or influenced by age factors. Let me tell you about, if I ever remarry, about a couple of dates that we're going to go on. And this is being live streamed, and my daughters have, it's okay for them to hear this. One of the dates that I'm going to go on with my next wife, and we're going to go hand in hand, and we're going to go to her doctor. It's going to be romantic, really romantic. I'm going to take a flower for the doctor, and we're going to go to the doctor, and we're going to talk about her health. And then we're going to go on another date, and we're going to go to my doctor. And I think maybe I'm going to buy a fishing pole for him, and I'm just going to, and we're going to go, and we're going to talk about my health. You think it'd be right if I had ulcerative colitis? You think it'd be right for me to marry somebody who didn't know that? If you've got some sort of a medical condition, you think it'd be right for the other person not to know that? There needs to be transparency. If you want a closer relationship with other people, let me tell you about a key. One of the keys to close relationships is transparency. Being open, honest, frank, holding nothing back. Transparency. Transparency is a key to close relationships. It is also a characteristic of intimacy, of close relationships. That is one of the agonies of widowed people. We don't have that person to be totally transparent with, totally intimate with in every way. Some of these things have to be talked about ahead of time to be fair. Can you imagine somebody marrying somebody else who was having memory problems? And the person without the memory problems didn't know it? Talk about being trapped. You talk about feeling cheated. And it happens. What about finances? You've got financial goals, you've got accounts, you've got budgets, you've got debt, insurances, wills, estate, inheritances. And you know what? I have been doggedly condemning prenuptial agreements since the time that we birthed them in our culture. I think they are programming marriages for failure. That said, if you have especially adult children who are concerned about their mother or father being taken advantage of, but this mother or father who want to get remarried have no issues like your adult children might have, I can see the possibility of considering, not for your sake, but for the sake of your adult children, I can see the possibility of drawing up a prenuptial agreement just to calm the fears and concerns of your adult children. Let's imagine I meet a widow. She is knocked down dead gorgeous. She is a millionaire. Now, I would love to marry her. Now, I've been a preacher all my life, so I've got $150, okay? She's a millionaire, a gorgeous millionaire. I've got $150. Okay, now, we are married. Let's say we're married 10 years, and she dies first. And there's this boatload of equity, this $1 million of worth. Now, I have 3 daughters. She has 3 sons. So do they split that 6 ways? Okay, well, let's say I die first. Each of my daughters get 50 cents. Do those 3 men, those 3 boys, do they get a quarter of each one of my daughters, 50 cents? You see how financially, how difficult that this can be, and how sometimes these are things that we need to think about, and we need to talk about. And then, where are we going to live? Whose house are we going to live in? Maybe we're going to live on both. Keep them both. Live with both places. Where are we going to live? Maybe we're going to sell. Maybe we're going to sell one. Maybe we're going to sell both. Or are we going to buy? Or are we going to build? Where are we going to live? I know of cases where people have gotten married. This issue hasn't been sorted out and thought about enough, as well as some of the financial things. And so one of the 2 people in this second marriage decide they don't like living like they had designed, and now they've got trouble in their marriage. She doesn't like anymore living hundreds of miles away from her grandchildren. So now you've got stress in a second marriage. It's very personal and very difficult to deal with. But what are you going to do about where you live? By the way, I'm going to live in the $1 million mansion owned by that cute wife of mine in that second marriage. There are risk factors. in every human relationship, there are risk factors because every human is flawed. Every human relationship has risk factors. Whenever we decide to have a friend, we're also sticking our neck out and risking because friends can hurt us. We can be friends and hurt other people, intentionally and unintentionally. Human relationships have risk factors. Well, we need to think about the risk factors. We can't eliminate risk factors in human relationships, but what we can do is we can reduce them. And what we're talking about with some of these things to consider is we're trying to reasonably reduce the risk factors in a second marriage. If there is one word I can use to describe a second marriage consideration, is it can be complicated. It can be complicated. I was having lunch with a few folks in Sebring, Florida, during the time when I was down there for a workshop. And I met this lady who was widowed and remarried. And when we happened to be talking about the complications in regard to a second marriage, and she said, well, my second marriage wasn't complicated. And the preacher, her local preacher said, honey, the reason why your second marriage wasn't complicated is you married a very uncomplicated man. And that's true. Sometimes it's not as complicated as it can be with other people. But the way to sort some of these things out is talk about some of these things that are involved with these relationships that are second. Remarriage at midlife or later is somewhat like the merger of two major corporations. Be wise in what you are doing. I think that is a very, very good thing to think about. Don't go into a second marriage without doing your homework. Just like don't ever marry the first time without doing your homework. If you believe in premarital counseling, and I hope you do, I will not perform anybody's wedding ceremony without premarital counseling. Not because I can eliminate risks in that premarital counseling, but because I want to reduce the risks. If you believe in the value of premarital counseling to go from being single to being married, do you think there might be a value in talking about going from being married to being widowed? Do you see the sense in that? Thinking about that beforehand, before you transition, one of the two of you transitions from being married to being widowed. Now let's add a third stage. What about going from widowed to being married? See, we need to think about that beforehand. The best time to think about that is not when we're emotionally driven or dominated, but when we've healed and recovered to some degree and can sort through these things rationally. There you go. You have been so kind, and I know it's been extremely difficult after lunch. The last thing that I want to share with you is back above the exit and the entrance out there. You know, we've got a banner here. These are the three mottos of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry. Don't die until you're dead. Don't waste your pain. And back there, I can and I will. I can and I will survive. I can and I will cope. I can and I will grow. No matter what experience of loss that you have, no matter how tragic, how sudden, or how expectant that the loss might have been, I can survive. One step at a time, one breath at a time. Eventually, I can learn to cope. And if I keep working on my coping, I can grow through that experience and bring glory to God and be a blessing to other people. I hope that there's been some benefit here. Tomorrow morning, during our Bible class time, we're going to talk about praising the Lord no matter what in your life. No matter what. Praising the Lord no matter what. We're going to talk about that. It'll be more of an open discussion sort of a thing. During the preaching time, the only time I'm going to preach at you is tomorrow morning during our worship time. We're going to talk about what we ought to do when we are overwhelmed. We're going to go into David's life. We're going to look at a time in David's life when that old boy was a mess. He was a mess. But he really, I think, by his example, teaches us what we ought to do when we are overwhelmed. There's a lot of life experiences that can cause you to be overwhelmed. Losing your spouse is certainly one, but it's not the only one. So hopefully you'll be able to come back tomorrow. Brother Raymond, Feel free